again, when you get into that micro level, at the city level, it's going to be different for everywhere. But I think that, again, that first step is outreach and education, and it has to be agnostic and unbiased. So when you get into outreach and education, forward-looking statements, can come back and bite you in the butt. So if we're saying,
Absolutely.
these aircraft are going to be silent, you're not going to hear them, and somebody hears them, they're going to say, "Oh, you lied." And so what else, do we have to question, in your statements? And so we need to level set, and be honest. And I found some success with this in Los Angeles, to where I did some research and found that the groups that were the most vocally against the advanced air mobility work that the city was proposing, and went and talked to them. And they primarily consisted of transit advocacy groups, transportation advocacy groups. And what I learned is that the framing, that we're using, the messaging that the industry is putting out there, is a big part of the problem. And so when there's a lack of information, the community will fill it up with the most outrageous and worst case scenarios that they can think of. And that's going to be the reality for them. It's not flying cars. This is aviation. And the operations are going to happen at aviation facilities. Framing the conversation back to aviation was beneficial in many ways. And so with a lot of these groups, I was able to ask them, what do you hate the most about aviation? And in Los Angeles, I was like, well, it's noisy. We have to deal with the helicopters flying over our heads, and it's hard to have a conversation when they're overhead, especially if they're going slow or loitering. It's polluting. We know that there's issues, and around many of the general aviation airports in the Los Angeles region, the lead exposure is becoming an increasing concern. And then the inequity piece. So I get to sit there and look at the airport, and I have to breathe the air and everything and deal with the noise, but I don't get access, to the amenities and benefits that the airport really provides. And so with that, I was able to take that and say, all right, well, with advanced air mobility, this is the next evolution of aviation, an iteration of aviation, not flying cars. And within this iteration and evolution, we're trying to make it more quieter. We're trying to make the emissions less impactful, and we're trying to make the equity, issues less prevalent. We're trying to make this open to more people, And so with the first two, we might see immediate significant reductions. They are far quieter, not silent. You will hear them, but they're going to be far quieter. And pollutions, if it's all electric, is negated, immediately, and that's of course the direct emissions. We still have to deal with life cycle, issues on that, but
Yeah, the
we'll
indirect
deal
impact
with
on
them.
the yeah.
Right. And so I was able to go back to them and say, listen, like the three things that you hate most about aviation are the three things that we're trying to improve. And
Yeah.
at the end of those conversations, they were like, all right, well, and this is similar to my experience in Utah. I still don't like what you're doing, but if this is improving those three things, then maybe we can stand aside a little bit and see where this goes. And if
That's
what you're saying is true, right?